Hello, everyone, and welcome to Expert Webcast. I'm Alex Kasdan, Managing Partner of Convergence, and I'm pleased to moderate today's panel on trends and transactions in technology M&A. We've got a great panel of speakers here today whom I'll introduce in a moment. We have received a few questions from the audience already, and I would encourage everybody viewing this program or listening to the program to submit questions to the panel or any of the speakers. Let me start by introducing Dario DiMartino, who is a partner in the corporate practice of Allen & Overy in the New York office. Dario's practice focuses on domestic and cross-border public and private mergers and acquisitions, carve-outs, joint ventures, strategic and private equity transactions, and corporate governance matters. Dario represents a broad area of major US-based and multinational technology, including software, semiconductors, IoT, cloud computing and AI, financial services, life sciences and healthcare, and industrial companies. He regularly advises global companies in a variety of complex matters, including with respect to acquisitions and strategic investments in blockchain-enabled technologies. Dario is a frequent speaker and writer on various topics in M&A and private equity, with a particular focus on innovative technologies in the fintech and medtech industries. Dario serves as a co-chair of Allen & Overy's blockchain and fintech group, advising clients on transformative matters relating to cryptocurrency and blockchain-enabled technologies. Dario holds his law degree from Columbia Law School, as well as the Federico, the Second University School of Law. Dario, great to have you on Expert Webcast.
Thank you, Alex. Happy to be here.
Elaine Carey, Managing Director at FTI Consulting. Elaine has served as an advisor and problem solver to senior executives of Fortune 100 corporations and law firms for more than 30 years, overseeing clients' most complex and sensitive problems around the globe involving integrity, political security, and reputational risks. Elaine also co-leads FTI Consulting's cannabis practice. Her expertise includes due diligence, fraud, business intelligence, FCPA, anti-money laundering, compliance and investigations, cannabis compliance, mining, Latin America, asset tracing, intellectual property theft, and supply chain issues. Elaine has helped corporations identify and work through thorny reputational issues, including environmental, health and safety, as well as labor practice issues, including slave labor and trafficking. Early on in her career, Elaine was an investigative journalist reporting from more than 30 countries on political, economic, business, and social developments, including establishing an office in Moscow for Cox Newspapers in 1988, where she spent 5 years chronicling the end of the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. Elaine, your background expertise, particular interest now with what's going on in the Ukraine and Russia and its effect on M&A that we'll touch on. Elaine holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in English Literature from Grinnell College and was a mid-career fellow at the Harvard University Russian Research Center. She's a certified fraud examiner and anti-money laundering specialist. Great to have you on this program.
Thanks, Alex.
Richard Anderson is an experienced Silicon Valley entrepreneur who has spent the past 25 years in finance, operations, and advisory roles at market-leading companies, including Apple, eBay, and Ernst & Young. Richard is the founder and CEO of ShareVault, where he leads an energized team of cloud technology pioneers who are driving the leading edge of secure document sharing and collaboration for businesses worldwide. Richard has a bachelor's degree from Whitworth University and his MBA from the Haas School of Business at the University of California at Berkeley. Richard, great to see you on Expert Webcast.
Thanks, Alex. Great to be here.
And then Erin Spaulding is a managing member of Spaulding Financial. She has more than 20 years of experience in all forms of valuations and has provided various financial consulting services to numerous organizations in her time with Spaulding Financial, Singer Lewak, PricewaterhouseCoopers, American Appraisal Associates, and Guernsey Snyder. Erin holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Applied International Finance from the American University of Paris, France. She is a certified valuation analyst accredited by the National Association of Certified Valuators and Analysts. She is a certified merger and acquisition advisor accredited by the Association of Mergers and Acquisition Advisors. As an expert, Erin has served attorneys and corporate clients in shareholder disputes, lost profits and economic damages cases with valuation economic modeling capabilities. She has spoken on professional panels in the areas of corporate transactions related to private equity, venture capital, angel-backed, and independent sponsored deals. So, Erin, great to have you back on Expert Webcast.
Thank you, Alex.
Great panel of speakers here today. To jump right into the discussion, we're talking about tech M&A. To put things in perspective, last year, 2021 deal volume, global M&A volume exceeded 5.9 trillion. About 20% of that by volume were technology deals. Actually, looking at a study published by Daria's firm, Ellen Overy. For the first time in 2021, tech deals exceeded 1 trillion in deal value, which was 71% higher than 2020. And I think that number could also actually be higher, and depends how we define technology, which we'll talk about. So let me turn to Daria. You're an M&A lawyer. You're focused on technology. Let's talk about the state of the tech M&A market. What do you see in your practice?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Look, 2021 and this past 3 months have been a record year for tech M&A. I see increased appetite for tech transactions across the board, right? I see a lot of higher valuations for tech companies. But what I see, which may be surprising, is an appetite for proven technologies. So it's not about sort of the cutting edge stuff that I think we all like to work on. It's mostly about traditional, conventional technologies, right? Cloud services, communication software, business analytics, of course, cybersecurity, semiconductors. Technologies that buyer can immediately apply in their businesses over, again, more cutting edge technologies like machine learning and robotics. But one common denominator, I guess, in all of this is sort of deal makers' optimism for tech M&A. I see transactions at every level of the market. I represent a lot of buyers, established buyers that are interested in acquiring emerging companies, but more specifically their IP or their people, right? And of course, I see the mega deals. And what I've noticed over the past 12 months is that there's a lot of sort of new entrants in the tech M&A market. There's a lot of sort of high growth companies that are expanding outside of the US, and then they use M&A as a way to enter new markets or buy new technologies or hire new talent. So these are sort of the trends that I see in my practice. But as you pointed out, it's been just a record year. Big tech companies are making acquisitions at an accelerating pace. And I think there's just a growing sort of confidence in the market, which I think is going to translate in a sustained trend.
Thank you, Daria. It's very interesting. One thing I think we've learned with the pandemic is how dependent we are on technology on a corporate and individual level, and also how technology enables just about every industry to function, particularly. It hasn't changed how industries operate, but it certainly has accelerated changes in many industries, from healthcare to communications, on and on and on. And you brought up an interesting point, Daria, on the valuations. So let me turn to Erin as a valuation expert on the panel.
Okay.
Are these valuations sustainable in your opinion? What are you doing on the valuation front?
So we look at valuation from more of a fundamental perspective. Anything that's happening today in the market is to some extent, it's noise. So we have a much longer lens that we get to inform us. Yes, I think there is still a lot of room in terms of the valuations that we're seeing. There's still room to grow. And as tech is just so dynamic and there are so many different ways in which it can be integrated into different platforms, different sectors, I hate to say it's limitless, but that is definitely, I think, the indication, at least from the multiples that we're seeing.
Thank you, Erin. We'll come back to that. Let me turn to Elaine on the you're experts in due diligence. You're an expert on what you call people diligence. How has that changed during the pandemic, and what are we seeing? And how is technology any different than any other industry in terms of due diligence?
Well, during the pandemic, I don't think it's changed a whole lot because a lot of the work we do, we don't necessarily have to, we certainly don't have to travel, and I have colleagues all over the world. We can do a lot of what we do just from our computers and access to full databases that tell us lots of things. Technology, I think, is a little different sometimes, can be, in the sense that, we've seen instances where you have big splashy companies that are going to revolutionize the world. And you can see the Theranos example where it didn't do that at all. So a lot of what we probe into is not so much, obviously, we're not scientists or doctors, which some of these companies, have people like that who founded them and led them. But we could poke around a lot of places to ask people about, what do you know about this kind of technology? Does it work? In many cases, we find that, you find some gruntled sounding, half crazy sounding professor who's posting all over the web. And most people would say, oh, it just sounds like a lunatic. But, then we go find that actually this person has a patent that actually the lawyers might want to look at really carefully. Or they just lead you to other people to say, maybe that, this technology isn't all it's cracked up to be, or there's similar technology overseas. And there's a suggestion that maybe the IP was stolen. So there's a lot of more digging that can go on in that world, even to the point of whether or not, sort of theses that have been written and posted and registered. You pull up one of those and think, that sounds very familiar, but it's not the same person on it.
Actually, and I want to come back to on a couple of points to you, and then to Daria on the due diligence side. But let me turn to Richard first. You see a lot of deals in various industries, including technology, and you bring technology to deal making. So how has the deal making changed from your perspective? How has due diligence changed?
Well, I think that, one thing that's changed is just our, kind of collective facility or comfort with online meetings, and, adding that, it's the quasi personal dimension to, the in-person dimension to having these conversations. I think that's important to getting deals done at the conversational level. And I think below that, there's a lot of data and documents and due diligence rigor that's required to get things done. Those capabilities have been around for a while, but they're evolving, and there's in some ways there's a bit of a convergence. For example, we've for the last year to 18 months, we've been supporting tamper-proof streaming video inside of the due diligence room, inside of the data room, because a lot of companies are adapting to video to their purposes, and showcasing innovation to partners, scientific advisory boards, things like that. And so those assets can be useful in due diligence. So I think there's just a general evolution, a rising of the tide for technology, and it's finding its way into the diligence process and M&A, and a lot of companies are getting better and better at the understanding and driving toward a metrics-driven business. That's incumbent on pretty much any company, especially tech companies. And so that data is able to be utilized for the purposes of either preparing for M&A or actually in the throes of an M&A conversation.
Thank you, Richard. Let me turn to Dario on the subject of sort of due diligence, understanding what you're buying from the buyer's perspective. And there's been quite a bit written on tech M&A that is different from other industries, because you really, while financial and legal diligence is obviously very important, probably less so than other industries, because you really need to focus on the people and what you're buying, and you're buying the future. And I think of there was an interview with Jeff Bezos a couple of years ago with asked him, where is Amazon going to be next year or the year after? He said, I don't know, you should have asked me. I'm paraphrasing, about 10 years ago. So when you're doing tech deals, you're really looking at the future. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, yes. Look, there's always a few issues and challenges that come up in tech M&A. And so there's always issues around ownership of software, issues around source code and open source code. So, one of the first things that we do for a tech buyer is making sure that they understand the origins of a target's software product portfolio. You need to understand how the software was developed. As you said, was it developed in-house? Was it developed with the help of third-party contractors? Was it licensed? Was it acquired in a previous acquisition? And if you don't really carefully understand the history, then you may have issues post-closing. Or there could be issues that come up during due diligence that could undermine the valuation, right? As Aaron knows very well. So for this reason, sometimes I recommend that my clients, when I'm on the buy side, make it a signing or closing condition that certain software and IP issues revealed during due diligence be remedied. Also, it's really important to conduct technical due diligence on the source code for any software that's being acquired, and not just to check the ownership, as I just mentioned, but also to ensure that the source code is of high quality, that it's scalable, and as you mentioned, Alex, before, not vulnerable to cyber attack. And so what we do, although sometimes targets resist that, is, and I know that panelists, my co-panelists know this very well, Elaine being one of them, we do what we call penetration tests. So we basically stage spend tests on the target's software platform, of course, with the target's permission, to ensure that they have appropriate security standards. And then, virtually in every deal that I work on, there's issues around open source code. And, remember when I started doing tech M&A, 17, 18 years ago, open source, or the use of open source code was sort of slightly frowned upon, but now it's sort of widely accepted in the industry. But of course, there are risks, right? So a certain open source code, if used in a particular ways, needs disclosure and licensing of the code to the public, which of course would undermine the value. And so again, we really get into the weeds of software and open source due diligence to make sure that it's been properly licensed and then also used responsibly. So there's a lot of sort of documenting and addressing issues that could be tricky, which is why we typically create some sort of a playbook for tech buyers.
Thank you, Dario. Let me come back to Aaron on the valuation side. Are we accounting for all the upside and the risk given the uncertainty of the last couple of years with the pandemic? And there's some notable examples that come to mind, whether it's Peloton. I mean, what happened, right? It was the highest, arguably the tech company as well as the exercise company.
Right. That's a really good question. I mean, that's one of those, are we accounting for all the upside? No, definitely not. But we're also absolutely not accounting for most of the downside that comes with any kind of a black swan, which, we've had a few recently. So that doesn't usually get baked in, definitely not in the bottom up analysis that goes into a deal model, but also not into the discount rate that, or the systematic rate of return that's systematic risk premium that's discounting these exorbitantly high future cash flows back to present value. So no, we're not baking in a lot of the downside. We are baking in as much of the upside as I think we can see. So I think the trick is to really poke holes in some of these goals that management has, and to say, what's the reality of this, and then given your management team and given the capital constraints that you have and given your supply chain issues, this is the reality based on your specific company, that unsystematic risk.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. Let me go back to Elaine on the Dario just brought up cyber attacks, cyber vulnerability, which has been quite a bit actually written on that lately with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the potential for cyber attacks. Is there a way to deal with that during due diligence and sort of understand what you, as a buyer, what you're buying is really what you think you're buying, and as the seller, you have the assets to sell that haven't been hacked into?
Yeah, we work side by side. We do the people side, and my colleagues from cyber do the cyber side, which means, as Dario mentioned, penetration testing, but also means that we look at whether or not they've got enough cybersecurity staff. Do they patch as frequently as they should? Do they log? A lot of people don't log very much, and so it's hard to tell what's happened. They don't have good cybersecurity training or healthy multi-factor authentication. Those things are all often found to be wanting, which all lead to possible hacking. And then, of course, the size of the company matters. So, how do they track their third parties, their vendors? What access do they have? Are they good at closing down when people have left, et cetera? And, if anybody doesn't think that, state-sponsored hacking is not alive and well, you've been under a rock or something, because, you have to, frankly, you do have to be careful about who you hire. A couple of very prominent companies in the tech world and in Silicon Valley that, I've had a meeting or two with the FBI and said, I think this guy's a Chinese spy. And FBI agent just smiled at me and said, you might be right. So, I mean, it's out there, and you've got to be careful about it. And if you don't take a look beforehand, then you could be, look at the SolarWinds whole project, that how they hacked into everything else from there. And in fact, right before the war started, I looked at some IT providers in Ukraine that were providing source work and projects to Western companies to make sure that the minute the Russians rolled across the border, the Russians weren't going to have a SolarWinds kind of backdoor into various industries here in North America. Luckily, we didn't find any in one particular case, but you've got to think about all those things, because they'll bring your deal down in a hurry.
And then
Alex, if you don't mind, I was just going to mention, I totally agree with Elaine that these threats are on the rise, and many of them are by design by the perpetrators to be invisible to us. We're being asked to, from a encryption and a data protection standpoint, to help our customers secure much more than just the documents that are inside a secure repository, including their source code libraries, making sure that those are encrypted and locked down to individual machines, so that the source code, if it were ever extracted, basically becomes unintelligible if it's not operating in the approved environment. And also just native files in general, just securing other documents like CAD designs or chip designs, to make sure that those are only, they're handled very carefully and only with trusted parties. And the term for it is zero trust. And that's a trend that we're seeing, and that, I think it stems from the concerns around cyber, but it just becomes good information governance as we evolve, particularly in tech companies.
The other thing people miss is when they have key people who have access to those things, when they leave, particularly in this environment, when people are jumping jobs so quickly, make sure you shut them down, and that they don't still have access, and that you've taken everything away. Often, over and over again, when IP goes missing, I hear them say, oh, but he was, I had lunch with him every day. I didn't want to make him feel badly, so I didn't grab his computer right away. Mm-hmm. Really?
It's such an important topic. I mean, I don't think you can overstate it. And what I always encourage, particularly software companies, to do is have a very, very, and you always have to invest the time in maintaining it, but have a very thorough topology diagram of what the landscape of your platform looks like horizontally, and also vertically understand your software stack at every level, and including the workstations, as Elaine said, and when someone leaves, there has to be a way to systematically remove them, not rely on, someone to remember, oh yeah, I need to do that, or a checklist. And so, it's, and whenever I have a meeting with our Chief Information Security Officer, I'm always asking, where in our stack, do we have concerns right now? Because it always should be an area where we're digging in and, looking further, verifying, making changes, updating software in an area, making sure patches are applied. There's just a lot to it. So if you have that stack and you have a horizontal landscape of your, well designed and well maintained from a architectural diagram standpoint, I think you can answer prospective buyer or prospective partner or customer questions when they come up.
It's a great point. Thank you, Richard and Elaine. Well, let me turn back to Dario as the deal lawyer on the panel. And I would think that those issues are particularly acute when a larger company is buying a smaller one, because cybersecurity is only as good as your weakest link. And it's people involved. Plenty of cases, especially with everybody working remotely. There was a well-publicized case a while back about high-level government official taking home computer and plugging into the AOL dial-up. I'm sure those things happen. How do you safeguard your clients during due diligence from things like that?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. And you just have to get into the weeds and conduct very thorough due diligence, and you got to document and address these issues and making sure to factor that type of exercise into the timing of a deal, right? It's sort of imperative that people conduct this type of due diligence and closely manage this risk, especially if the target is more of a young company with a sort of relatively undeveloped approach to managing cybersecurity. So the way that I see it, the more the young the company, the more you gotta amp up your cybersecurity due diligence.
Are there any concern on your end that some of these deals and some of the technology companies getting too big? Antitrust concerns?
Yeah, I do see a lot of antitrust issues coming up in these deals, and there's been a lot of antitrust and sort of merger control activity in the past few years, especially as it relates to IP. I'm not an antitrust lawyer, so I typically bring in my antitrust specialists, but I do agree that antitrust and sort of national security have become sort of front and center with respect to M&A. And I think that over the past 10 years, what's actually become even more pressing than antitrust is actually CFIUS, national security, and it's not just the US. I do a lot of cross-border M&A, and I've noticed how, of course it's CFIUS, and especially what happened with Firma starting in 2018, but it's really happening across the world, right? There's been so many instances and increasing filings from regulatory authorities that sort of screen deals for national security purposes. And again, in the US, I always tell non-US buyers of US companies, but also US sellers, to factor into timing considerations CFIUS, because, and this is something that a lot of market participants tend to sort of discount, but it's actually become really important, because since Firma, now CFIUS has the authority to review transactions that would allow a non-US person to gain control of a US business. But it's not just about control, it's also about non-controlling investments in US business to the extent that they relate to critical technologies, critical infrastructure, or sensitive personal data. And this is not just a theoretical risk, oh yeah, we'll worry about CFIUS if and when that happens. CFIUS can actually impose divestitures even after the deal has closed. And so whenever there's a non-US buyer, specifically for certain regions of the world, I always ask to conduct a CFIUS analysis. I'm happy to get into the weeds of that, but I want to open it up for discussion.
Thank you, Dario. I want to come back to CFIUS, and I think Elaine probably has quite a few comments on that. Let me turn to Aaron before we do that on the valuation side. In valuing tech deals, are you, I mean, all the risks that we're talking about here that Dario was just talking about, and Elaine and Richard, does it all go to the discount rate, or there's something else you're doing on the valuation side?
Yeah, a lot of it is in the discount rate, but it should be baked into the cake, itself, right? It should, a really good deal model, right? Pre-transaction deal model is going to take into account everything under the sun that you can fathom, as much as possible, including synergies that are with the acquiring company. I mean, most of these deals are strategic. Even the financial buyers are still strategic deals. They're looking at it, for their portfolio companies or a platform. But yeah, so most of the value drivers and costs associated to all of those, revenue streams are going to be baked in. But then there's, of course, the return that's required by, the investors, and that's in the discount rate. I don't know if that actually answered your question completely. Was there more?
I think it does.
Okay.
Thank you, Aaron.
Okay.
Let me turn back to Elaine. And Elaine, I sort of made full circle from chronicling the end of the Soviet Union to where we are today, with all the geopolitical things, and I'm not talking about the human tragedy of the war that's going on, but it certainly has quite a bit of an effect on M&A in general, but more so on tech M&A, given the first of all, the extent of software development in Eastern Europe, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, or neighboring countries, but also the investment that has been flowing from Russia into US-based and not the European-based Asian companies. How do you track sort of the I guess the investors, the shareholders, and look at these companies in light of the sanctions that are the US and European sanctions on Russia?
You can do it, but it's not an easy job because there's a lot of very clever layering. So you get a lot of companies that hook to other companies. You get shell company upon shell company, and then you got to keep following the line until you find a person. In the case of Russia, then you have to understand not just, and the people, you'll hit a person that then, because we do a lot of this, we go, oh, okay, this person's tied to Putin, but it's not tied to Putin because it's on the list of oligarchs. It's tied to Putin because it's a much lower down person, but you have to know the ins and outs of who's who in the Russian hierarchy. So it can be quite tricky. And they usually, you go through Cyprus, you go through various other countries that just instantly, put our the hair on the back of our necks up when you see Cyprus or various other jurisdictions that you just know the Russians have used. So it can get to be, and it's often layered in with other very, what you would call respectable, mainstream UK firms, whatever firms. But so you really have to dig through lots of entities that look very bland, that seem to have no purpose, but they actually have a purpose.
Thank you, Elaine. Let me go to Richard. Many tech deals across border, and with technology, when you may not have the hard assets or sort of brick and mortar, so to speak. Are those more complicated? What makes them different than just domestic deals from your perspective?
Well, I think, with cross-border deals, there's an opportunity to provide tell a rich, a full and complete story about your business in the eyes of the cross-border counterparty. And I think that's required. I think understanding working with firms like Elaine's to understand the regulatory requirements, as well as Dario as well, understanding the regulatory requirements on both sides to make sure that's clear. I think that there's an opportunity then to tell this very complete story, because the regulatory standards, for example, have moved online. The federal ones and most of the state ones have moved online. So they're based around flexible data standards, like XML is a standard that's used in some that we see, and so that those very granular compliance requirements, regulatory requirements, have a lot, can tell a very detailed story about an asset or innovation here in the U.S. Well, I think that can be translated to represent what that means in other jurisdictions and in the world. It requires a bit of extra work to pull that all together, but I think it can be very compelling to the other parties. And I think just this applies to M&A in general, or tech M&A, is it's incumbent on the buyer and the seller to really have a thorough way of encapsulating what their growth story is and how that applies to, the whatever markets their solutions could be marketed in. And I think doing that, it's a bit of heavy lifting, but showing in the eyes of the potential buyer what the accretive value is for that, and then building that into the financial model and the forecast, and you can do that if you can do that for multiple prospective buyers in various countries. Then I think you might be able to drive up the overall value, get a little competitive bidding going. The other thing, just as a last kind of fine point note on this, the systems such as ShareVault, our system, are very multilingual in their architecture these days. So you can actually cater to companies with certain, not necessarily every document, but certain, many important documents can be represented in multiple native languages, just to provide a little more liquidity in the conversation, which could be at the early stage of deals, to get kind of shine a nice light on your investment in the quality of that conversation, letting them understand in a native language what some of your key inventions are, or key customer stories, things like that.
Thank you, Richard. Let me go back to Dario as the tech M&A lawyer, and perhaps we're stepping back a little bit. What are the main drivers for this tech M&A boom? And I hear a lot of fancy terms like transformative, digital transformation. Are those really the drivers, or is it just sort of desire for scale and market share?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I think it's probably the latter. I think it's difficult to generalize, right? Because tech could mean a lot of different things. But generally speaking, part of the reason for this growth is related to the pandemic, right? I think we all can agree that the pandemic has proven that sort of the digital economy is now central to our lives, and user-facing technologies have become sort of so normalized that this has driven transactions and attracted an enormous amount of capital. But I think that there's a few key drivers that I see sort of recurring in the space. There's the desire to diversify product portfolios. There's a desire to access new intellectual property to sort of create operational efficiencies. Through M&A and tech M&A, you can reach new customers or entering entirely new markets. And of course, that's sort of the acqui-hire strategy, right? Acquiring people. And I see particularly a desire to acquire software developers and engineers, because that sort of talent remains very scarce. And then finally, the one that I see more and more in the sort of the fintech industry is using M&A as a way to meet new regulations or acquiring licenses to operate in multiple jurisdictions. One of the deals that I just closed was structured to start operating in a new jurisdiction and acquire the target company's licenses.
Do you see the boom sort of driven by strategics or private equity, or both?
So I tend to represent strategics. I just have more fun representing strategics. Although recently I've seen that a lot of PE houses are starting to act like strategics, because they have a lot of portfolio companies that they want to merge with other companies. Say, I recently worked on a software merger of equals, and even though the client was a PE house, they wanted me to, treat the deal as if you were strategic. So we conducted the same level of due diligence that we would conduct in a strategic deal.
Question actually for Dario and Elaine, maybe you brought up aqua hires. So is that, especially in tech, I have some examples, but I won't share them, of software engineers having multiple companies that they're working for. So Elaine and Dario, how do you handle, the due diligence, and how do you figure out if there are conflicts of interest between the different companies that they're serving? How do you find out if they're serving multiples? I mean, that's a sticky subject.
It is. The first thing would be to look at their employment contracts to make sure that they didn't sign any non-compete. And then even if they sign a non-compete, you want to make sure that that's actually enforceable in the jurisdiction in which they work. But you're right, that happens a lot more frequently than I'd like. And so it comes down to a question of contractual law and the jurisdictions of the place where they actually work. You also got to look at what they're actually working on. You could be working on a new technology that has nothing to do with another employer's technology. And so you really got to get in the weeds to understand the scope of the services they provide or the type of code that they're developing. Elaine,
That's why we look at their backgrounds to see who they really are, who they say, as opposed to who they say are, who they say they are on LinkedIn, because those things are often quite different. So when we do discrete sourcing, talking to the people in the industry, sort of zeroing in, then you will find out, you'll hear rumors that, oh yeah, but they work for so-and-so and they've worked for so-and-so in the past, or, so we have had to call up and say, do you realize they worked for the competitor for a long time? They may be actually doing this to steal the IP.
And especially in the era of everybody working from home, you have multiple opportunities at one desk, I imagine.
Yeah, much greater vulnerability. Elaine, just coming back to that, on the background checks or understanding what the principles are, is it as important, let's say in software as other industries? In other words, in the absence of something really egregious, if the software is great, whoever designed it is sort of, people know the software, but not the principle behind the software, perhaps. Is it as important as other industries to really understand what the principles are?
I think it's always important because it may come back to haunt you sooner than later. I mean, if you look in particular, a lot of the major quote unquote tech deals, such as Theranos or Uber or WeWork, there were a lot of clues in the personalities of the founders that just got overlooked. I mean, I guess maybe from the days of Steve Jobs, people are like, oh, they're supposed to be that way. Yeah, maybe, but I think there's much less tolerance for that these days. And so investors in particular, or buyers, are going to be very picky about how those people are acting and behaving both in the office and out of the office. I don't think you can get around those two things today, because usually whatever the person's doing outside of the office, they do the same thing in the office. I'm not a believer that they've got a split personality just because they go to work, whether it's just sitting in front of their computer at home. And those issues, particularly with younger generations, Gen Z, whatever, when it comes to where they spend their money, those things are important to them. And it just, it doesn't take much for one of those founders to do something or say something that, just irrelevant of how good the software, the tech is, can tank the company.
And the information gets disseminated a lot quicker than it used to. I think that's.
Oh yeah.
Richard, you're smiling in the background. What on the deal side of things, what do people wish they'd done differently after the deal closes?
Well, I think a lot of folks who go to market with the deal wish they had done more self due diligence. That's a fairly common sentiment. Preparing also, I think it's part of self due diligence, being able to, paint as I mentioned earlier, paint the value picture in terms that the buyer can really understand, and having, that can drive deals way up, or it can, having a fuzzy story, or having, they're going to vet the management team and see if the story is consistent across the team. So having a consistent story around, what's working really well for the company and what the challenges are, knowing what those are. I think that's really important. Validating that benefit to the buyer. I think sometimes they get, and Dario touched on this, they get in trouble for not, completely validating IP for the buyers. And open source is tricky, and you have to make sure you use it carefully and compliantly. So making sure, so proving ownership of IP is super important, and avoiding those, subsequent claims and litigation around, claims and counterclaims around IP ownership is important. I think another one I would touch on is just a lot of times, getting the legal house in order and resolving any sort of unresolved litigation or potential litigation before the deal happens. I think, people can reflect on deals that, went forward, but had some knocks against them, some valuation hits against them because of things like that, or fell apart because that side of the house wasn't in order. And, you can look at all the various parts of the organization, but just those are some key areas where I think deal makers can look back and say, if we had only done that or those things, we would have had a better outcome.
I agree with Richard. I think it's actually really common for people that were once associated with a company to claim a share of IP, specifically in software that they've helped code when transactions are announced or they're nearing close, or even sometimes at post completion. So due diligence is super important. And there's also situations where a change of control may trigger sort of escrow type arrangements of code where, sort of an end customer may have the right to access or sometimes even buy a copy of the code. And so you want to make sure to review all the licenses to make sure that they, may be terminated due to a change of control event. You may also want to look at past versions of the code to see if, may have been sold or licensed out in the past, which could undermine its value. So agree 100%.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry. I am curious, for everyone's take on what's that single biggest factor in post-transaction integration failure? Is it not doing enough due diligence? Is it, where do you see it? It sounds like that's where you see that happening the most.
Correct. It's a post-closing dispute that sometimes, arises in connections with the lack of due diligence.
I think from my perspective as a banker, also the corporate culture, as I think as overused that term is much more important in tech deals than other deals. It could be as basic as I walk into some of these tech companies, and I've done it where everybody's wearing a torn up T-shirt and has long hair, and a bunch of people walking in suits and briefcases, and you have nothing in common with them whatsoever. And if you're going to integrate a company like that into prim and proper sort of large corporate Fortune 100, it's not going to be great integration. I don't know, Dario, if you run into those issues.
I do, and that typically comes up in connection with deals that have been structured with an earn-out, where part of the purchase price is paid post-closing based on the reaching of certain milestones. And so, if the target company turns out not being the owner of the software or other technology, or if there are certain licenses or certain sort of codes that were sold or licensed out in the past, typically the buyer may want to adjust the purchase price or not pay the earn-out entirely.
The other thing that comes up is that deals are made at the top, and the CEOs may get along famously, but as you go down, they're very different cultures. And then you have the problem, particularly with tech companies. You've got people who do very creative things with code, etc. If they feel like they've been cheated in the deal, if they walk out the door, does it still work? Sometimes it doesn't.
Right.
Yeah, culture is definitely not one of those things that gets baked into the deal model. You can do a very meticulous job month over month of every single one of the inputs, and culture is just, how do you do that?
It's hard.
So you have a roadmap, right? But you can't merge the cultures if there's really, it's just not going to work.
I think much of that comes out in management presentations, Dario. I don't know what your experience with that is as a lawyer, because you can, typically on tech deals, principals tend to know each other and tend to know the company, so it's not their first exposure to each other. Private equity acquisitions may be different.
Yeah, no, I'm actually seeing this pop up in deals more and more frequently. The sort of the culture due diligence or the cultural assessment of a target company, and this typically happens when big public tech companies buy startups, right? There's sort of a cultural clash, and so what typically happens, and I see again this more and more recently, parties actually negotiate certain aspects of the culture, and so I've seen people that are, a little bit more intransigent say, no, we're a public company, we can't make certain changes. And it also depends on the ask, right? If you just want a kombucha on tap, that may be fine. But there's other companies that may say, we've been compensating our folks with cryptocurrencies, for instance, and there's public companies that say, well, we can't do that. And so again, these cultural issues come up in negotiations and are now more and more being negotiated.
And those only get worse when it's a cross-border deal.
So cryptocurrency is an interesting one. Are you seeing more transactions involving cryptocurrency?
Yes, a lot of transactions around the sort of platforms that facilitate the exchange of cryptocurrencies are very hot these days. Also, software companies that provide the infrastructure to either mint tokens or run a blockchain-enabled business. Those two areas are very hot right now.
And they're particularly hot in the US because of the fact that they're expecting regulation to come down. So there's a bit of a war to see who can be, who can make the grade and be one of the biggest ones standing when, and able to deal with regulations when they happen. I'm not sure it's going to happen fast.
Yeah, and we can talk about regulation all day long. I'm generally in favor of a sensible regulation, because what I've seen in my practice is that for the first time in my career, I can't give my clients certainty about the regulatory treatment of crypto assets. And so what happens is that we need to then structure sort of offshore entities or rely on non-US jurisdictions, which is not great for our economy. So a little bit of sensible, reasonable regulation in the space, I think it's actually going to create more jobs, more opportunities, and ultimately growth for the fintech/crypto space.
Well, it's a bit of a moving target at this point, so it's hard to really understand or to know where it's going to be 6 months or a year from now. I don't know, Richard, how that plays into your business model and the data room dealing with crypto issues.
It's a good question. I don't think we've really seen a change. We haven't come up with new ways of presenting crypto other than, or supporting specific due diligence in crypto. But it's an interesting question. That there may be certain things that come out around crypto due diligence. I know Dario deals with the practice of it quite often. And we would be interested in finding ways to expedite diligence around crypto. I think if it's blockchain and it's incorporated in source code or in the innovations, that is discernible and can be assessed. But just if there is cryptocurrency on the balance sheet or different things like that, I'm sure it adds a whole nother dimension to it.
Right, and it depends on the actual digital asset that you're either investing or acquiring, right? Is it Bitcoin, is it Ethereum, or is it an alternative coin? The regulatory analysis changes quite dramatically based on the actual token or pool of tokens that you're purchasing or investing in. So it can get quite complex, but deals are being done in this space. So there's a way to make this happen.
Thank you, Dario. Let me switching gears a little bit. One of the things we haven't touched on here is ESG, which has become a big part of just about every M&A deal, every industry. Is there a special significance for ESG on the tech side of things? Dario, if you want to take that first. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. Happy to. Look, I think it's important to remind everybody that there's an increasing body of research that has shown a positive link between ESG and financial performance. And so I think it's always good to remind people in situations like this that ESG is not just a theoretical set of criteria, but it actually has an impact on valuation. And I think in the M&A world, sort of a company's failure to understand and properly address ESG factors is increasingly viewed as a risk to the company's long-term value, and so it affects valuation. So I've seen buyers actually reducing the price of a transaction upon discovering ESG-related liabilities. And look, ESG is a really a big category of issues, but let's just think about a company's failure to hire and retain diverse talent, right? That's huge. There are studies that suggest that companies that are more diverse perform better. But to give another example, think of an investment in a solar energy project, right? You may tick all the boxes from an environmental perspective, but not so much if the target is as questionable employment practices or operates in a jurisdiction where there's bribery or corruption, right? So it's a broad category. It's very important, but it's also I want to say that despite a lot of progress that's being made and that we should be happy about, I think we're still at the very early stages of this shift in sort of boardroom thinking around ESG.
And environmental tends to be a little tricky, especially on the crypto side of things.
Right, and there are some tokens now that are changing the way that transactions are verified on the blockchain. So from a proof of work system, which is very energy intense, people are trying to switch to a proof of stake, which is less energy consumptive. But yes, it's still an issue that's front and center for software developers in the crypto space.
What is as tech becomes more important, particularly even in terms of climate change, whether you're developing better batteries, we're gonna start using more and more minerals that come from other places that present new problems. People are talking about electrostates as opposed to petrostates, and those are going to present very new and different challenges, but they're going to be ESG challenges across the board. You've got to go to the Congo. It's not a good place. There's a lot of trouble there.
Sure.
So those things are going to just become heightened concerns. And as Dario said, that you can't say you're doing ESG if you don't do it, because that's going to definitely tank your deal, or you're not even going to get to the table.
Yeah, I'd say, just to be super pragmatic about it, the due diligence structure and the we call it a due diligence checklist that the sell side company sets up and fills in. I think having a very robust ESG section, and just breaking it all out, because 10 years ago you would have seen environmental, but you wouldn't have necessarily seen a societal or a social issues area, and governance would be maybe woven into a lot of things, but just breaking it out specifically so that it's that everything is well structured and easy for the buy side to review.
That's interesting. We also touched on sort of cross-border deals, now interconnected technologies, and I'm just looking at the news flash that U.S. just sanctioned entire segments of Russian industry, primarily tech companies, semiconductor, software, that are providing their services and goods to abroad and vice versa. So I've got to believe that there's going to be some effect on the tech M&A space. U.S. companies, both positive and negative. We've got a couple of minutes left on this webcast, and I want to give each of the speakers an opportunity for any closing remarks, or perhaps touch an issue that we should have addressed here but didn't get a chance to. Elaine, how about we start with you on the diligence side of things? And
sure. So I talked a little bit before about how important the people are. The one thing we didn't touch upon, which often comes up, is that because you're talking about tech, you have scientists, you have doctors, you have that create some of these companies, they're not always the best businessmen, but they're very dedicated to their company. So I think you have to test whether or not they, they obviously may be the ones that are going to be there at the top, but are they the right ones to run the company? I did one in Silicon Valley where people said, this guy is absolutely brilliant, but as a person, he's horrible. And they literally said, put him in a padded room, don't give him access to money or budget to spend, and don't let him talk to people. And he was in a Silicon Valley company, and he would walk down the hallway and ask people who came from India why they wore the pajamas to work. He was that bad. But they didn't want to let him go because he was really brilliant. So, people always say, oh, Elaine, don't ruin my deal. I'm not going to ruin your deal, but you might want to structure it a little different and avoid some of those problems.
Great point. Thank you, Elaine. Let me go to Richard.
Yeah, I guess parting advice as a technology entrepreneur, I think oftentimes we think of technology companies as single product companies or single innovation companies that are just this, they have the crown jewel, and that's the thing that's attractive. But I think oftentimes there are other technologies that come in along the way. It might be a tuck-in acquisition. It might be some sort of a really strategic technology partnership. I think it's incumbent on the company to look at all the technologies that are involved in that they go to market with, and have very good diligence around all of them and all the things, because you get busy and you may have acquired something really, really important or maybe dangerous, if it's misused or something, and having not given that the rigor that you did for the thing you've been building for 10 or 15 years could understate value or underrepresent a risk.
Right. It's also ever-changing technology, right?
Yes.
May seem to be really exciting today, may not be so exciting, a year from now or a couple of years from now.
Right. Yeah.
Erin, let's go to you on the valuation side of things.
I guess parting advice. The deal model is a roadmap. It's the recipe for how everything post-merger, post-acquisition should run in a best case scenario. And if you can stick to the roadmap and really understand it, especially if as the acquirer, I think you're going to maximize the success story around that transaction and that deal. Those are my parting words, I think.
Thank you, Erin. Let's go to Dario. Dario, it's an exciting field to be a lawyer on this deal. It's vision and potentially very, very high reward.
It is an exciting time, not so much for your sleep these days, but yes, it is an exciting time. Look, my parting thoughts, I guess, whether you're on the buy side or on the sell side, you will do better if you're well prepared for the cultural, political, and regulatory complexities that are inherent in software tech M&A and more particularly in cross-border tech and software deals. And I think that now, more than ever, quite frankly, you've got to have a lot of advanced preparation, strategic implementation, and sort of in deal structures that are sort of calibrated to likely concerns, I think are critically important.
Thank you. It's been a great program to moderate. Learned quite a bit. I would encourage everybody listening or viewing this program to reach out to the speakers. Please reach out to me and I'll be glad to put you in touch with the speakers. Tech M&A is an exciting area. I think it's going to be, my prognostication is going to remain very active, certainly this year and for the foreseeable future. High risk, but very high reward potentially. But please surround yourself with people that have worked on tech deals before, such as people on this panel. I wish everybody a lot of luck on Tech M&A. With that, I'd like to thank Richard, Erin, Elaine, and Dario for putting together a great presentation, and we're adjourned.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye.